This week I'm talking about why boundaries are important for your well-being and how to set them. So, let's talk about mental health. This is Let's Talk About Mental Health, a weekly podcast about mental health and well-being hosted by Jeremy Godwin. Let's talk about mental health, because the more we talk about it, the easier it gets. Hello and welcome to episode 53 of Let's Talk About Mental Health, the weekly podcast full of simple ideas for better mental health and well-being. I'm Jeremy Godwin, thank you for joining me. This week I'm talking about boundaries and mental health, so let's get talking. Boundaries. The very word may make some of you recoil in horror, because you might think that I'm about to go all Dr. Phil daytime talk show host and start waffling on about a whole bunch of airy-fairy ideas, which I'm not. Because boundaries are real, they are important, and they are something that will most definitely help you to maintain good mental health and well-being. The term boundaries can often seem a bit self-helpy in the sense that it's one of those terms that gets thrown around a lot, especially by people who seem to consider themselves experts but don't actually have any formal training. For me, the idea of setting and maintaining boundaries is about not putting up with shit from anyone. I'm going to go into the much more scientific, psychological terms later on, but let's just say this right up front. It really is about not putting up with shit from anyone, including yourself. And it's also about not tolerating things that will do harm to your mental health and well-being, which is a pretty broad way of looking at it, and I will be exploring this in a lot more detail this episode. But since I'm always thinking about what is the most simple way to do things, because for me, given a choice between simplicity and complexity, simplicity wins every time because I just don't see the point of making life more difficult than it needs to be. I thought it would make sense just to be really super blunt about this topic up front. You always have a choice about what you will and will not accept from other people and from yourself. And so that's the focus of today's episode. So let's start with some definitions. What are boundaries? Boundaries can be defined simply as what you will and will not allow in your life. Think about a house. Most houses have fences, which are a clear signal to other people and yourself to show where your space begins and where it ends. And it sends a message that being in that space requires your permission. It's not about building walls to keep people out, unless you're really antisocial and you decide to go all electrified fence and barbed wire and that type of thing. But instead, it's about providing clarity on what your limits are. The psychological definition of boundaries is really no different. It's about setting parameters and limits on what you will and will not accept. I tend to also look at boundaries as something that you set with other people and something that you set with yourself, in terms of what behaviours, etc., you will and won't accept from yourself as well as other people. You might have particular boundaries at work that are different from your home life, or the way you interact with your friends could be wildly different to how you interact with your family members. Boundaries can be flexible, and they may not necessarily be a one-size-fits-all. For example, I don't talk about finances with most people, but one of my aunts and I talk about stuff like that all of the time. Again, it's something that might flex and change depending on who you're interacting with and the type of relationship that you have, combined with how much you're willing to let them have access to specific parts of yourself. I see boundaries as being a very big part of that whole prevention is better than cure thing that I talk about a lot in this program. Because what you're doing is consciously identifying what you will and will not accept, then turning those limits into something more tangible for the benefit of yourself today and in the future. Sometimes you might be setting boundaries in a reactive way. For example, you might be addressing a relationship issue that you're already dealing with. But it's still being proactive in the sense that you're hopefully drawing a line in the sand and saying this far and no further. When we talk about boundaries, it's most commonly linked with our relationships, whether that's romantic or platonic, friend or family, etc. And it's often our closest relationships where we can struggle to set or maintain our limits, or even both. My thing on this is that I love my family and my friends dearly, but I'm also not going to tolerate crap. So, like I said back in episode 19, family, it can sometimes become necessary to distance yourself if things are toxic. Just because someone is a relative, whether that's by blood or marriage, that doesn't automatically give them unrestricted access to you at the detriment of your mental health and well-being. You can choose what limits you set and how you enforce them, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. Let me give you an example, a simple example of one that I use. With the work I do, I find myself very often receiving DMs or emails asking me to work with people who I've never met, or more commonly, people who want to be interviewed on this show, or wanting me to promote a product or service. Now, I rarely do promotions unless it's something that I actually use and believe in, so that's 99.9% of requests immediately going into the no pile. And as for interviews, well, anyone who's ever listened to the show would be well aware that I don't do interviews on Let's Talk About Mental Health. And to be frank, it kind of pisses me off when people contact me wanting me to interview them, and it's really obvious that they've never even been to my website, let alone actually listen to my show. Anyway, so I have a standard response that I use, which is basically a polite thanks but no thanks. Interviews aren't part of what this show is about. And I used to write a much longer spiel about why, but now I've learned to just politely say no, and then it's up to the other person to do with that what they will. The thing about boundaries is that sometimes you just have to say no for the sake of your own mental and emotional well-being, even if that feels uncomfortable. And sometimes it's about saying no because you've set a particular framework for something, and some people might want to push that. Saying no is something that I've had to work with. I'm fairly assertive, but I'm also prone to a bit of people pleasing. And when it comes to feeling comfortable with saying no to something that doesn't fit within your boundaries, like all things, that can take time and practice. For me, a lot of this comes back to this simple point. You have to do what's right for you. Now, there's a fine line between looking after yourself and being selfish. And most of you know that I always talk about giving more than you take, as well as doing no harm and being kind. But when I talk about those things, they all apply to yourself as well as the way that you treat other people. When it comes to setting boundaries, you have to be mindful of how much capacity you actually have to be able to share with others. That capacity may ebb and flow, depending on what's going on, but ultimately you can only give what you can give. If you're running on empty or close to empty and you have nothing left to give, then you have to take care of your immediate needs and honour your boundaries before you can hope to interact with anyone else in a way that's not detrimental to your mental health. So I think that leads fairly nicely into the next part of today's episode, why a boundary is important for your mental health and well-being. Normally I start this section with something quoting from a quality mental health source, and never fear, I will be quoting some shortly because that's a boundary that's important to me on this show. Everything needs to be grounded in quality research, not just my opinions. But I'm actually going to start this section by saying a few things that are hopefully common sense, but most of you listening will probably know me and my bluntness by now. And if you're new here, hi, strap yourself in and prepare for a few very direct statements. So here are a few fundamental things about good mental health and well-being that come up quite often in Let's Talk About Mental Health, which I think help to clarify in no uncertain terms why boundaries are so important. There's 3 points. Number 1, if you don't define what you will and won't accept, other people will decide it for you, and they may even take advantage until you have nothing left to give. The second point is, if you don't like something and you don't do something to either change it or change the way you interact with it, for example, if you choose to stay at a job that makes you utterly miserable rather than looking for a new job, that is 100% on you. And my third point is, if somebody takes advantage of you and you either don't set and enforce boundaries with them, or if there aren't any consequences if they do breach your boundaries, that is also 100% on you. You can request other people to do or say things, or not do things or not say things, but you cannot control them, just as they cannot control you. So all you can control is what you do, say, and feel, and especially what you do with your feelings. So if somebody is breaching your boundaries repeatedly and you're not enforcing any consequences, that now becomes your issue. Now, some of this might seem a bit controversial or overly blunt. However, let's not tiptoe around this here and pretend that we don't have choice about what we tolerate from other people, or even from ourselves. You know, that's like me shoving a cupcake in my mouth and then saying that it's the manufacturer's fault for making them so delicious. And just a side note here, I've been talking about my issues with emotional eating. I'm actually making some positive progress with getting it back under control. So there certainly won't be any cupcakes in my near future. But anyway, I thought I'd share that just because I like oversharing. The thing with boundaries is boundaries matter because they spell out to ourselves and to others what we will and won't put up with in terms of things that have a direct effect on our well-being. If there's someone who is always nasty to you, you don't have to put up with that shit. My view on things is to always at least try to address the issue, because we should not just cut people off without first making them aware of their behavior and how it impacts on you, and then giving them an opportunity to change. But it's that old saying, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. It's that in action. Boundaries are worthless if they aren't adhered to, and if there aren't consequences for breaching our boundaries. So, according to Healthline, and the link is in the transcript for this, some of the benefits of setting and maintaining healthy boundaries include better self-esteem, better relationships, conserving your emotional energy, and more independence and space to grow as a person. According to positivepsychology.com, and again, the link is in the transcript, and I'm going to quote, "Healthy boundaries are a crucial component of self-care because poor boundaries can lead to resentment, anger, and burnout. More generally, the consequences of not setting healthy boundaries can often include stress, financial burdens, wasted time, and relationship issues, which can cause mental distress. In other words, a lack of healthy boundaries can negatively affect all aspects of someone's life." Like I said, the link for that is in the transcript. However, before I move on, let me just read one more sentence that I think sums up what I've been saying so far. "Setting healthy boundaries can have many benefits, including helping people make decisions based on what is best for them, not just the people around them." And so with that in mind, let's jump into the how-to part of this week's episode. How to set and maintain boundaries. So there are a number of points that I'm going to go through, and let's start with reflect. So consider what is important to you, what's working, what's not working, what makes you feel comfortable versus uncomfortable, etc. And think about what types of boundaries might need to be looked at. Some examples of boundaries are not being taken advantage of, not being taken for granted, not repeatedly lending money to someone who doesn't pay you back, not taking responsibility for another person's actions or having to look after them, not accepting abuse of any kind, emotional, mental, verbal, financial, or physical, not being devalued or disrespected for who you are or what you believe in. And just a side note here, regular listeners know my thoughts here. And the thing is, if you do no harm, are kind, and give more than you take, then it doesn't matter whether you follow a particular religion or no religion at all, or if you believe in the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles for that matter, you do you. And so the piece there is about saying that, we should be respecting one another's beliefs. And that's also a boundary, which is to have my beliefs respected. So take some time out and reflect and think about what's working, what's not working, and really consider where you may need to look at putting some boundaries in place. Part of that is also listening to your feelings and your gut. If something or someone makes you feel uneasy or uncomfortable or unhappy, and especially if that happens a lot, then that is a sign. Your gut knows things way earlier than your logical brain does, and so it's important to follow your instincts. For example, if you resent having to do something or having to spend time with someone, that's a pretty strong sign that things are not good. And so it's up to you to identify what is happening, why it's happening, and most importantly, what you're going to do about it. And that leads on to the next point, which is to be direct and assertive. Now, not everyone is comfortable being as direct as I know I can be sometimes, but even if you are, that doesn't mean that you're like that all the time. There are many types of conversations or situations that make me feel cringy or like I just want to avoid confrontation altogether. The thing to remember though is that if you don't ask, you don't get. Meaning that if you want things to change, then you need to take the wheel and steer things towards where you want them to go. All of that stuff is wrapped up in assertiveness, and I'd encourage you to check out episode 45 for more on the topic of assertiveness and mental health if you haven't already. And I'd also recommend last week's episode 52, which is about change. And also when it comes to relationships, especially romantic or intimate ones, I'd suggest that you check out episode 38 for more about boundaries and relationships. You can find all of those at letstalkaboutmentalhealth.com.au/episodes, where you can listen to the audio or read the full transcript. Back to the point of being direct and assertive. If you need to say no to something, say no. And you don't have to apologize or justify why you're saying no, just be polite. So moving on to my next point, when you're identifying boundaries, be fair and reasonable. For example, you might not like your partner doing something, having a particular hobby, but providing it isn't doing any harm, just let them get on with things. Boundaries must be mutually respectful. And again, I remind you that in all things, our focus should be to do no harm to ourselves or others, to be kind to ourselves and others, and to give more than we take. Again, that means ourselves and others. Remember, it's not just about taking. Life is about give and take. Moving on to my next point, decide what you will and won't give your attention to. So, unfollow social media accounts that make you feel shitty about yourself. Block people who bully you. Stop reading stuff about politicians or public figures who spew hatred and try to whip the public up into a frenzy. Don't like how toxic Twitter is and how they allow anyone to say pretty much anything they want and call it freedom of speech instead of recognizing the clear distinction between hatred and free speech? Then don't go on Twitter. Even better, delete your account. You know, another example that I talk about a lot is setting limits with how you interact with the news cycle. I'm sorry, but nobody needs to be informed 24/7, and we certainly don't need every little event overanalyzed and combined with opinion pieces. When it comes to how much news you expose yourself to, you're in control. My point is that you can choose to set boundaries around what you will and won't consume and what you will and won't do. And that's an example of the setting boundaries with yourself bit that I mentioned earlier. And then it's up to you to not just set those boundaries, but stick to them. Speaking of, use tools that help you to maintain your boundaries. When I was researching this episode, I found quite a lot of websites were bombarding me with autoplay videos and things flashing in the corner, and it was to the point where I had to keep reminding myself to use Apple's Reader View feature, which is an absolute blessing to help you focus and avoid sensory overload when you're trying to read articles. You know, you might need to set a timer on your phone to remind you to keep calls with that overly chatty and long-talking friend to a set time frame so that you can get on with your day. Or maybe you need to use software on your computer or device that prevents you from taking a sneaky peek at social media for a set period of time when you're supposed to be working. Find what works to you, but there are plenty of tools out there that can help you with those boundaries. If you find boundary setting difficult, and especially when it comes to your relationships with others, especially family, get support if you need it. Working with a counsellor or therapist can help you to work through different issues, as well as exploring ideas for how to tackle challenging situations. And it's something that you can sort through in a safe space with a person who isn't going to judge you or be weighed down by emotions. Now, you notice I mentioned family in there really quickly, and I've kind of skimmed the whole family thing because we all know that, boundaries with family can be really challenging. I covered family in a lot of detail back in episode 19, so I don't want to repeat myself so much. But let me just say that it doesn't matter whether or not, like I said earlier, it doesn't matter whether or not somebody is related to you, by blood or marriage or whatever. It doesn't automatically give people access to you, unfettered access to you. You get to decide how people have access to you. So just because somebody is a close family member doesn't mean that they have the right to do or say things repeatedly that have a negative impact on you. So, you own the piece around setting boundaries there. It's up to you to be really clear about what you will and won't accept. But, somebody being your sibling or mother or father or whatever, it doesn't automatically give them a right to treat you like shit and to just disrespect your requirements. So please make sure that you have that distinction clear in your mind, that family do not get special treatment or should not get special treatment or a free pass just because they're family. Does that make sense? Anyway, my next point is stick to your boundaries and provide positive recognition, reinforcement, and encouragement when your boundaries are being respected. Even just a simple thank you can go a long way in terms of saying, hey, I see what you're doing here. Thank you for respecting me. Now, I left that one until last because I think it flows nicely into a few final bits here. And the first being, what do you do if your boundaries are not being respected? Here are a few tips. First, respond calmly, rationally, and non-judgmentally. Now, I know that can be challenging, which means that if you are struggling to get past the emotional response, you might need to hit the pause button and remove yourself from the situation for a couple of minutes or even longer. But then you need to come back and respond calmly, rationally, and non-judgmentally. Don't just let it go, because that's silently endorsing the behavior. Even if you don't like confrontation, it needs to be addressed, because otherwise it will potentially become a much bigger issue. As I often say, deal with issues while they're still small, so that they don't have a chance to grow into huge problems that are then harder to resolve, or which might cause more damage to your mental health and well-being. My next point is call out what has happened. For example, we agreed to do this, however, it's not happening. Explain how you feel, again, be calm and rational, and restate your wants and needs. My third point there is to decide on your limits. For example, I do a 3 strikes and you're out thing, but for more serious things, I might not even allow 3 strikes. So it's about you making a decision on what your limits are and then communicating them and, most importantly, sticking to them. Which leads to my next point, which is to implement and follow through on consequences. For example, you might say, I'm not going to be able to talk to you for a couple of weeks because I need some space to process what has happened. Or it could be, I need to see actual sustained change, otherwise I won't be able to continue seeing you. So notice that it's about stating and restating your needs, not making demands or giving ultimatums, because that's emotional manipulation. If the other person is breaking the boundary repeatedly, call out the behavior. For example, I've asked you several times not to do this, and each time you say that you respect my wishes, however, within a week or two, we're back at the same place, as though we hadn't agreed to make this change at all. I will not tolerate any further instances of this. So it's about calling it out. And then it's about being consistent. So don't just apply the boundaries sometimes. If you give people a free pass to abuse the boundaries, you're sending a message that it's okay. Also, another example here is if you have kids. The boundaries that you set need to be in place 100% of the time, and they should be fairly and consistently applied to all. Otherwise, you're sending a clear message that the boundary is not serious. The same applies for anyone with friends, family members, neighbors, co-workers, etc. And then my final point here is to know the difference and respect the difference between ghosting and maintaining your boundaries. Please don't ghost people. If you have an issue or your needs aren't being met, communicate that. Don't just stop talking to someone and never answer their messages or whatever, because that's just mean. It's horrible when someone stops talking to you and you have no idea why. So if you wouldn't want to be treated that way, then don't do it to other people. Look, I'm no saint and I admit I've done it before in the past, many years ago, when I've been really pissed off at someone, but I make a point now of not doing it, and instead I focus on setting and maintaining my boundaries, which is a much fairer and kinder approach. Now, also a quick note here about respecting other people's boundaries. I've talked about give and take extensively, and so I think it's important to remember that each of us has our own limits of what we feel comfortable with. So please be mindful of other people and be courteous. Their boundaries may be different to you. Now that doesn't mean that you have to tiptoe around them, just be respectful. For example, pay attention to verbal or physical cues. If someone's moving away from you, that might mean that you're in their personal space, the limits of which is different for each of us in terms of what we're comfortable with. I also suggest to be aware that some cues, like lack of eye contact, may actually be different cultural norms. For example, some Indigenous Australians may tend to avoid eye contact. Or it might also be potentially a sign of neurodiverse behaviours. For example, those on the autism spectrum. Probably the most straightforward way to respect other people's boundaries is to simply ask. Never just assume, and if you're not sure, then just ask questions. Even if it feels awkward, often that can lead to a much more pleasant outcome and avoid any potential misunderstandings. Finally, we're heading towards a time of year when we often find ourselves spending more time with our extended family, and so it's time to start thinking about your boundaries. Now let's be honest, for many of us, the holidays this year are going to look very different, and it is what it is. So you may need to stick to your boundaries even more so than normal, especially if, for example, you might feel pressured to attend a family thing in person, but maybe you don't feel comfortable with that due to the pandemic. And can I just say quickly, to anyone feeling a little bit triggered by that line of discussion, especially if maybe you're in lockdown at the minute and not sure if you'll even be able to see people in person over the holidays, you have my utmost empathy. And I know that this is a trying time for many of us. So take things one day at a time and focus on what is within your direct control. Look, for all of us, with so many big things happening this year, like COVID-19 and the US elections, etc., it is a very real possibility that even if you are with your family, you might find yourself in difficult situations because of the, shall we say, variety of different beliefs that people have. I talked about a lot of this stuff back in episode 11, the holidays, and episode 19, family. So I would recommend checking those out if you haven't already. Like I said, you can find all those at letstalkaboutmentalhealth.com.au/episodes. However, the main thing I want to say here is to set your boundaries in a fair, kind, and thoughtful way. I mean, don't just be an arsehole and tell everyone to piss off, because that's not a boundary, that's being obnoxious. But also don't put yourself in an unnecessarily vulnerable position. Look after your mental health. Because when it comes to boundaries and mental health, what it all boils down to is this. You're in control of what you will and won't allow in your life. And a big part of looking after your mental health is respecting yourself. When you set limits on what you will and won't accept, and stick to them, you're treating yourself with kindness and respect, which in turn is going to help you to treat others with kindness and respect. Like all things, boundaries take work and regular effort to set and maintain, and by doing so, you'll find yourself much better equipped to address issues and keep yourself focused on your personal growth and satisfaction. Each week, I like to finish up by sharing a quote about the week's topic, and I encourage you to take a few moments to really reflect on it and consider what it means to you. This week's quote is by an unknown author, and it is, "If someone throws a fit because you set boundaries, it's just more evidence the boundary was needed." Let me repeat that. If someone throws a fit because you set boundaries, it's just more evidence the boundary was needed. Alright, that's nearly it for this week. Next week, I'll be talking about trust. Trust is something that goes hand in hand with boundaries, and it's an absolutely fundamental part of good relationships. So next week, I'll be discussing what trust is, why it's the foundation of every relationship you'll ever have in your life, and how to build and maintain trust. I hope you'll join me for that episode, which will be released on Monday the 23rd of November in the morning in Australia, New Zealand, and the rest of the Asia-Pacific region, the evening of Sunday the 22nd of November in the UK, Ireland, Europe, and the Middle East, and the afternoon of Sunday the 22nd of November in the US, Canada, Central America, and South America. You can find past episodes and additional content at the website, which is letstalkaboutmentalhealth.com.au. And you can also find Let's Talk About Mental Health on Instagram, Facebook, and Pinterest at LTA Mental Health, as well as on YouTube. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to leave a 5-star review on your preferred podcast platform and tell someone you know about the show, because word of mouth really helps new people to discover the program. Thank you very much for joining me today. Look after yourself and make a conscious effort to share positivity and kindness out into the world, because you get back what you put out. Take care and talk to you next time.